For 27 years, the world moved on without him. Governments fell. Children grew up. His mother died. Nelson Mandela stayed in a cell barely 2 meters wide, breaking stones, counting days, learning how not to hate. Freedom came at 71. The real question is what it cost him to walk out, without anger. Robben Island was not designed to rehabilitate anyone. It was designed to erase time. Mandela's cell measured barely 2 meters wide. No bed. No privacy. Just a thin mat on cold concrete. Every morning, he was marched out with other prisoners to break limestone under the open sun. White dust filled the air, burning their lungs, cutting into their eyes. Years later, doctors would confirm the damage to his eyesight was permanent. Letters from family arrived once every 6 months. Some never arrived at all. Visits were rare. Conversations were monitored. Grief was private. When his mother died, the prison did not open its gates. When his eldest son was killed in a car accident, the answer was the same. Inside that cell, days stopped meaning anything. Seasons passed without markers. Mandela counted time by shadows on the wall and by the slow weakening of his own body. The goal was simple: make him forget who he was before prison told him who he was now. But something else was happening. While the world outside debated his name, Mandela studied his captors. He learned their language. He observed their fears. He realized that hatred, if left unchecked, would finish what the prison had started. Anger would turn freedom into another kind of cell. Robben Island tried to break his will. Instead, it became the place where Mandela learned the hardest discipline of all: how to survive without letting bitterness decide who he would become. Nelson Mandela was born in 1918, in the small village of Mvizo, far from the noise of power and politics. His birth name was Ralilala. In his language, it loosely meant, pulling the branch of a tree. A quiet warning of trouble to come. His father was a local chief, respected but stubborn. He lost his position after defying colonial authorities. Not long after, he died, leaving Mandela without a father before he was 10. That loss changed everything. Mandela was taken in by the Themba royal household. It was not a palace of comfort, but a school of discipline. Silence mattered. Words were weighed. Elders spoke slowly, deliberately. Children were taught to listen before they spoke, to observe before they acted. Power was never loud. It was controlled. This environment shaped him more than any classroom ever could. He learned that leadership was not domination. It was restraint. He watched disputes resolved not by force, but by patience. Every voice was heard. Decisions came only after long listening. Years later, Mandela would say he learned politics not from books, but from sitting quietly at the feet of men who understood how fragile order could be. But beyond the walls of that household, another lesson waited. As he grew older, Mandela began to see the structure of the world he lived in. Roads divided neighborhoods. Laws divided people. Opportunities were rationed by skin color. He watched white authority move freely while black families learned to lower their eyes and shorten their steps. The humiliation was not loud. It was daily. Routine. Normalized. That normalization disturbed him more than violence ever could. At school, he excelled. Education became both escape and weapon. Yet even knowledge had limits. No degree could change what the law had already decided he was worth. The contradiction hardened him. He was disciplined, but restless. Polite, but increasingly unwilling to accept the quiet injustice surrounding him. When he left home for university, it was not ambition that drove him. It was refusal. He refused an arranged life. Refused inherited obedience. Refused to live comfortably inside a system that demanded silence as the price of survival. When he was expelled for protesting student policies, it marked the first visible crack between Mandela and the order that had raised him. That moment mattered. Because long before prison taught him how to endure isolation, childhood had taught him how to control himself. Long before hatred tested him, he had learned the value of restraint. And long before the world expected forgiveness from him, Mandela had learned that power without discipline always collapses into cruelty. The boy from Mvizo did not grow up dreaming of martyrdom. He grew up learning how to listen, how to wait, and how to stand firm without raising his voice. Those lessons would later decide whether prison turned him into a symbol of rage, or into something far more dangerous. When Mandela arrived in Johannesburg, the city did not welcome him. It tested him. He took work wherever he could find it. Security guard. Clerk. Anything that paid enough to survive. By day, he blended into crowds of black laborers moving quietly through white-owned streets. By night, he studied law. Not because he believed the system was fair, but because he wanted to understand the machinery that crushed people like him every day. Law was not a shield. It was a map. As one of the few black law students in the country, Mandela quickly learned where justice stopped pretending. Courtrooms enforced rules written without him in mind. Judges spoke of equality while applying laws designed to exclude. The gap between theory and reality became impossible to ignore. The more he learned, the angrier he became. This was not a gentle awakening. It was abrasive. Mandela joined the African National Congress not as a symbol, but as a foot soldier. He organized meetings. He distributed pamphlets. He listened to stories that repeated themselves with minor changes. Families forced off land. Jobs denied without explanation. Passed laws turning daily movement into a crime. The injustice was systematic. Predictable. Efficient. Peaceful protest came first. Marches. Strikes. Appeals to conscience. They failed. Each peaceful action was met with arrests, batons, and silence. The Sharpeville massacre in 1960 marked a breaking point. Unarmed protesters were killed. The state showed it would answer nonviolence with bullets. For Mandela, this moment closed a door that would never reopen. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Mandela supported the creation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the resistance. It was not a choice made lightly, and it was not made out of recklessness. It was strategic. He believed violence was not the goal, but the language the regime had already chosen. Sabotage, not civilian bloodshed, became the method. Pressure, not chaos, became the aim. This shift changed everything. Mandela went underground. He moved constantly. He slept in different houses. He was labeled a criminal, a terrorist, an enemy of the state. International sympathy was limited. Even allies questioned his turn toward force. But Mandela understood something most observers missed: silence was no longer survival. Silence had become cooperation. In 1962, he was captured. The arrest was quiet. No spectacle. No final speech. Just the end of movement. He was sentenced first for leaving the country illegally. Then came the Rivonia trial. Evidence mounted. The possibility of execution was real. In court, Mandela did not ask for mercy. He delivered a statement prepared for death. He said he had fought against white domination, and he had fought against black domination. He spoke of a society where all could live together with equal opportunity. And then he said the words that sealed his fate. It was an ideal for which he was prepared to die. That was the moment Mandela stepped fully onto his own path. Not as a lawyer. Not as an activist. But as a man who had accepted the cost of refusing to submit. By the early 1960s, Mandela was no longer just organizing resistance. He had become its most recognizable face. His name traveled faster than he could. Across townships, across borders, across continents. To supporters, he represented defiance with discipline. To the state, he represented a threat that could not be contained by arrests alone. The government responded the only way it knew how: surveillance, infiltration, and pressure without rest. Mandela lived a life designed to erase routine. He changed locations constantly. Meetings happened in whispers. Plans were passed hand to hand. Every knock on the door carried risk. Every friendly face could be an informant. The strain was relentless, but it sharpened him. He learned to speak carefully, to move deliberately, to carry authority without visibility. This was his public rise. And it came with a private cost. His family life began to fracture. Long absences became normal. Danger followed him home. Relationships strained under secrecy and fear. Mandela accepted this erosion as the price of momentum. History rarely waits for balance. It demands focus, and it demands sacrifice. International attention grew, but it was uneven. Some countries admired his resolve. Others dismissed him as a radical. Western governments were cautious. Stability mattered more than justice. Mandela understood that global applause was unreliable. Power shifted only when pressure made neutrality impossible. In 1962, after traveling abroad to gather support and training, He returned to South Africa knowing the net was tightening. When he was arrested, there were no cameras waiting. No crowd. No last stand. Just handcuffs and a quiet removal from the world he had been driving so hard to change. At first, the charges seemed procedural. Leaving the country illegally. Inciting strikes. But the state was not finished. Evidence gathered from the Rivonia raid linked Mandela to sabotage operations. The tone shifted. The stakes rose. The Rivonia trial became a stage. The prosecution sought the harshest punishment available. Execution was a real possibility. The courtroom filled with tension. Observers expected defense, regret, negotiation. Mandela offered none of it. Instead, he delivered a statement that reframed the entire trial. He did not deny the struggle. He explained it. He spoke of a country divided by law, not accident. Of a system that left no room for reform through polite appeal. He rejected both white domination and black domination. He described a future built on equality and shared opportunity. Then he ended with words that froze the room. It was an ideal for which he was prepared to die. Those words traveled far beyond the courtroom. They hardened his supporters and unsettled his enemies. In that moment, Mandela became something the regime could no longer manage quietly. He was no longer just a defendant. He was a symbol, sharpened by clarity and resolve. The sentence spared his life. But it took everything else. Mandela was given life imprisonment. The world reacted with shock, then outrage, then resignation. Headlines moved on. Governments recalibrated. Inside South Africa, resistance regrouped. Outside it, campaigns began to carry his name as a rallying cry. And Mandela disappeared. No interviews. No speeches. No visibility. The man at the center of the storm was removed from sight, sealed behind walls and water. His rise ended not with applause, but with silence. The kind of silence that tests whether a movement can survive without its voice. For Mandela, the illusion of control was gone. The attention faded. The world moved on. What waited for him next was not glory. It was endurance. Prison did not announce itself as violence. It introduced itself as routine. Each morning began the same way. A door opened. Orders were given. Bodies moved. Mandela learned quickly that the real punishment was not pain. It was predictability. Days that repeated until memory began to blur. Weeks without markers. Months without meaning. Time stopped behaving like time. Robben Island stripped men of context. Prisoners were identified by numbers. Conversations were rationed. Letters were censored. Visits, when allowed, were brief and supervised. Mandela learned to compress emotion into minutes, then into seconds, then into silence. Grief became internal. Anger had nowhere to go. The limestone quarry was relentless. Sunlight reflected off white stone, burning eyes and skin. Dust-filled lungs. Guards watched closely, correcting posture, pace, attitude. The work was designed to exhaust the body and dull the mind at the same time. Years later, Mandela's eyesight would never fully recover. But the more dangerous damage was invisible. Isolation changed how he thought. At first, anger gave him energy. It sharpened focus. It reminded him why he was there. But anger is a fuel that burns fast. As months turned into years, Mandela realized rage was not sustainable. Left unchecked, it would hollow him out. The prison did not need to break him physically if bitterness could do the work instead. He began to notice something unsettling. Men who clung tightly to hatred deteriorated faster. They grew rigid. Their thinking narrowed. Their identities shrank to opposition alone. Mandela understood that if prison succeeded in defining him entirely by what he resisted, it would still win. Survival required something harder than defiance. It required discipline over emotion. Mandela started observing his captors. Not to appease them, but to understand them. He listened to their language. He learned Afrikaans. He watched how power moved through fear as much as authority. This was not submission. It was reconnaissance. He refused to let ignorance deepen the divide that already confined him. Inside his cell, Mandela imposed structure where none existed. He exercised. He read what he was allowed. He debated carefully. He chose words with precision. Every small act of self-control became resistance. Not loud resistance. Quiet resistance. The kind that preserved identity when everything else was designed to erase it. Loss arrived without ceremony. When news came that his mother had died, there was no release. No funeral. No final goodbye. The prison did not pause. Later, his eldest son was killed in a car accident. Again, no permission to leave. Grief was absorbed in isolation, without witnesses, without rituals. These moments tested something deeper than endurance. They tested meaning. Mandela faced a private reckoning. He could allow resentment to harden him. Or he could confront the possibility that hatred would keep him imprisoned even if the doors someday opened. That realization did not bring peace. It brought responsibility. The responsibility to decide, day after day, who he would be allowed to become. Prison narrowed his world to concrete and bars. But it also forced a choice. Either let suffering define him, or learn to master it. As the years accumulated, the prison changed tactics. The beatings became rarer. The isolation did not. Instead, a quieter pressure took over. Mandela was moved. Given slightly better conditions. Small privileges appeared and disappeared without explanation. The message was subtle: compliance could bring comfort. Resistance could bring nothing. This kind of uncertainty was intentional. Mandela understood the danger. Physical punishment hardens resolve. Psychological manipulation erodes it. He recognized the attempt to reshape him into a manageable version of himself. A symbol stripped of agency. A man grateful for small mercies. He refused the role. But refusal did not mean rigidity. Mandela learned that survival required flexibility without surrender. He began to engage prison officials in conversation. Not arguments. Conversations. He asked questions. He listened. He learned where authority ended and fear began. Over time, guards who had once avoided him began to respond. This unsettled both sides. To some prisoners, Mandela's approach looked like compromise. To the regime, it looked like curiosity. In truth, it was neither. It was preparation. Mandela believed that any future beyond prison would require dialogue. If that future was ever to exist, it had to be rehearsed where the stakes were lowest and the risks highest. Years passed. Governments changed. Protests outside intensified. Inside, Mandela aged. His body weakened. Illness came. Treatment was slow. Deliberate. The message was clear: time was not on his side. Then came the offers. Conditional release. Private conversations. Deals framed as generosity. Mandela listened carefully. He declined each one. Freedom that required silence was not freedom. Release that abandoned the struggle would turn his years into justification for defeat. He chose prison over betrayal, even when the cost was measured in remaining years. This choice clarified something essential. Mandela no longer saw himself only as a prisoner of the state. He saw himself as a custodian of what came next. Every reaction, every word, every decision inside the prison would echo beyond it. The weight of that responsibility was immense. It demanded restraint at moments when anger would have been easier. Behind closed doors, secret talks began. Not negotiations for release, but conversations about endings. The apartheid system was cracking under pressure. Violence loomed. Mandela understood that collapse without transition would drown the country in blood. This realization marked a turning point. He began preparing for a future he might never see. He disciplined his language. He refined his thinking. He trained himself not to respond to provocation with impulse. These were not the habits of surrender. They were the habits of someone planning to outlast the moment. By the time the possibility of freedom became real, Mandela had already changed. Not softened. Not forgiven. But recalibrated. He no longer measured victory by the fall of his enemies. He measured it by the survival of the country that would remain after them. Hatred, he concluded, could win battles. It could not build peace. And peace, however fragile, would require something prison had tried to eliminate: trust. When the door finally opened, Mandela would not step out as the man who entered. He would step out as someone who had learned, in the darkest conditions, how to keep power from becoming vengeance. The door did not swing open with celebration. It opened slowly. On February 11, 1990, after 27 years, Mandela stepped outside. Cameras waited. Crowds held their breath. The image would travel the world in seconds. But what mattered most happened before the first step. Mandela had already decided how he would walk. He did not rush. He did not look back. The country he returned to was not the one he had left. Violence simmered beneath the surface. Fear had settled into neighborhoods. Expectations pressed in from every direction. Supporters wanted justice. Opponents feared revenge. The past demanded acknowledgement. The future demanded restraint. Mandela understood the risk immediately. One careless sentence could ignite the country. One gesture of anger could validate decades of fear. He had been freed physically, but the margin for error was narrower than it had ever been. This was the real test. In his first public appearances, Mandela chose his words with surgical care. He spoke of unity without erasing pain. He acknowledged suffering without promising retribution. To many, it sounded impossible. To others, it sounded like weakness. Mandela knew better. He had spent nearly 3 decades learning how quickly anger could become a weapon that never returned to its owner. Behind the scenes, negotiations accelerated. The apartheid government was under pressure. Sanctions weighed heavily. Protests continued. Violence threatened to spiral. Mandela entered talks not as a victor, but as a stabilizer. He refused to humiliate his former captors. He refused to posture. Every meeting was framed around one question: what prevents the country from tearing itself apart? There were setbacks, provocations, murders that tested his resolve. Each time, Mandela responded with the same discipline prison had forced him to learn. He absorbed outrage without echoing it. He slowed the moment. He insisted on process over impulse. This did not make him popular with everyone. It made him effective. The most radical transformation was not political. It was personal. Mandela had to release something he had carried for years. Not the memory of injustice. Not the demand for change. He had to release the desire to see his enemies suffer. He understood that vengeance would feel like relief, but function like a trap. It would turn power into a mirror of what he had fought against. Forgiveness, for Mandela, was not sentimental. It was strategic. When South Africa held its first multiracial elections in 1994, the world watched again. This time, Mandela did not step out of a prison. He stepped into office. The moment was historic, but he treated it as temporary. One term. No consolidation. No clinging to authority. Power was a tool, not a destination. As president, Mandela prioritized reconciliation over dominance. He supported truth over silence. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was painful. It reopened wounds. It forced confession. It demanded restraint from those who had waited decades to speak. Mandela believed that a fragile peace built on truth was stronger than stability built on denial. His leadership did not erase inequality. It did not undo generations of damage. But it changed the direction of the country. It proved that transition did not have to end in blood. That history could be confronted without being repeated. Mandela left office the way he had left prison. Deliberately. Without bitterness. Without fear. The man who had once prepared to die for an ideal had learned something harder. How to live for it. How to step away when the moment required humility instead of control. His rebirth was not marked by speeches or titles. It was marked by consistency. He did not become who the world wanted him to be. He became who the moment demanded. After leaving office, Mandela did not disappear. He receded. There were no attempts to remain relevant. No shadow power. No quiet interference. He stepped away from the center with the same discipline he had practiced for decades. In a world where leaders cling to influence, his withdrawal felt almost unnatural. Age caught up with him quickly. Prison had taken more than years. It had taken strength. His health declined. Public appearances became fewer. When he did speak, it was not to command attention, but to remind others of responsibility. He spoke carefully, often briefly. Silence, once forced on him, had become chosen. Mandela's later life was not about correcting history. He understood that damage measured in generations could not be undone by symbolism alone. Inequality remained. Anger remained. The scars of apartheid did not vanish because the law changed. Mandela never pretended otherwise. What he offered instead was a framework. He showed that leadership did not require domination. That power did not have to be theatrical. That restraint, when practiced consistently, could hold a country together long enough for healing to begin. This was not idealism. It was realism shaped by suffering. Internationally, Mandela became a moral reference point. His image appeared on posters. His name was invoked in speeches. Awards followed. He accepted them politely, without attachment. The recognition was never the point. He had learned long ago that applause fades faster than consequences. Privately, he returned to a simpler rhythm. Family. Reading. Reflection. The man who had once carried a movement learned how to carry only himself. This transition was not easy. The world continued to project expectations onto him. Mandela resisted becoming a monument while he was still alive. He spoke often about forgiveness, but never as absolution. Forgiveness, in his view, did not erase responsibility. It prevented the past from dictating the future. It allowed space for accountability without perpetual punishment. This distinction was frequently misunderstood. Mandela accepted that misunderstanding as the cost of nuance in a world that preferred slogans. His true legacy did not live in policy. It lived in precedent. South Africa did not descend into civil war. Power transferred without bloodshed. Enemies shared rooms instead of graves. These outcomes were fragile and incomplete, but they were real. Mandela had proven that history could bend without breaking entirely. As years passed, his presence became quieter. When he died in 2013, the world mourned collectively. But the measure of his impact was not found in memorials. It was found in the restraint he normalized. The expectation he set. The idea that strength could exist without cruelty. Mandela never claimed to be perfect. He never denied his anger. He simply refused to let it rule him. That refusal shaped a nation's transition and offered a rare example of power exercised without intoxication. In the end, Mandela did not leave behind answers. He left behind a question. What does it mean to win, and not become what you fought against? Nelson Mandela did not spend 27 years in prison to become a symbol. He survived 27 years so that hatred would not decide the future. His story is often reduced to a single word: forgiveness. But forgiveness was never the beginning. It was the result of discipline. Of choosing restraint when anger was justified. Of understanding that suffering, when left unchecked, does not disappear. It multiplies. Mandela never denied what was done to him. He did not erase the past. He carried it, examined it, and refused to let it become a weapon. That refusal is what made his journey uncomfortable to admire. It demands more than applause. It demands responsibility. Most people will never face a prison cell. But many will face moments where resentment feels deserved. Moments where holding on to anger feels like strength. Mandela's life does not ask you to forgive blindly. It asks you to consider the cost of letting bitterness decide who you become. He did not win by destroying his enemies. He won by outgrowing the need to. The door eventually opened for Mandela. Not everyone gets that moment. But everyone faces a choice about what they carry forward. About what they refuse to become. So when the moment comes for you, what will your story be?